Satanism is a topic that I think evokes a lot of emotions from different people, but it's also one that is probably misunderstood and understudied to a significant degree. And that is why I'm today speaking with Dr. Per Faxneld. Dr. Faxneld is an associate professor in the history of religions at Södertörn University. He is an author of both fiction and non-fiction literature, as well as an expert on everything occult and esoteric. Would you agree?
I'd say that's a pretty good description, yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. Among other things, you have studied the topic of Satanism in different ways. You published last year together with Johan Nilsson a reader called Satanism, which tracks the basic the development chronologically, in some sense, of Satanism through looking at primary sources, which I found to be an excellent resource for studying the topic. And I thought maybe we could begin by just trying to tackle that very annoying question about the word itself. So what do we actually mean, perhaps primarily academically, but maybe also in general, when we say Satanism? What does that word actually mean?
Well, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that there's considerable disagreement between scholars on how to best define Satanism. Speaking for myself, the definition I prefer would be that Satanism is a system of thought where Satan, or an equivalent of him, is venerated in a central position. And if we unpack that a bit, a system of thought, I would say that's necessary to have in order to discern actual Satanism from, let's say, someone just like in a spur of the moment type way says they like the devil. Whereas veneration is something I prefer over, let's say, religious worship or something like that, since not all Satanists consider themselves religious, and the veneration can be purely symbolic. Yeah.
So that's a relatively broad definition then, which would include not just what we sometimes, and we will get to this later, but called theistic Satanism, but different types of veneration of the character of Satan in different ways. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so it can encompass, let's say, literary forms of Satanism to an extent, also political use of Satan, as long as, and that's the final part of the definition, as long as the figure is central enough.
When would you say that Satanism begins historically? Like, is this something that exists for hundreds or thousands of years, or is it a more perhaps modern contemporary phenomenon?
Well, that's something that is in a way kind of unique with Satanism, where the notion of there existing Satanists, that's very old. So basically have that in place already during the early centuries of Christianity. The idea that some people are venerating or worshipping the powers of darkness, interacting with demons and so on. But that was at that point just a projection, something you projected onto groups that you disagreed with somehow. Something you said that heretics were doing, for example. As for actual Satanism, that's something much more recent, if by that we mean people coming together in a group, forming some sort of organization. That's not really something that happens until at the earliest, depending on how you play with definitions, at the earliest at the end of the 19th century.
What do you think, and going back to your book, you also start tracing that history of the primary sources, at least in the 19th century, as you mentioned. What would you say is the factors in that particular time that makes it appropriate for this kind of Satanism and reinterpretation of the figure of Satan to appear in this particular moment in time?
I would say we probably have to go back a century or so to the Romantic period, where you have Romantic poets like Byron and Shelley, who were both politically radical and they were using the devil as a positive symbol of rebellion against authority, specifically, of course, religious authority, but also absolute monarchy. And in a metaphorical sense, for them, God was the ultimate monarch, in a way. And this, in turn, is something that they picked up from John Milton, from his epic Paradise Lost, where Milton probably didn't quite intend for people to read it the way Romantics did. But in their understanding of Milton's Satan, Satan became the ultimate rebel, a symbol of just rebellion.
So in the 19th century, then, we see people being inspired by that new kind of understanding of Satan as a symbol for rebellion. What are some examples of how that character is used in a perhaps political sense? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there's a direct line really running from the Romantics to early socialists. And with someone like Shelley, he was a sort of proto-anarchist. And later on, in the mid-19th century, anarchist thinkers started picking up the devil as well and using him polemically. So, for example, Bakunin and Proudhon, two of the major anarchist thinkers, both employed Satan in this manner as a symbol of rebellion against everything that had to be torn down for man to be free.
Right. You also, which is very much related to this, you wrote your PhD dissertation about feminism and the connection between Satanism and feminism, which, as I understand, argues for a similar employment of the character of Satan in early feminist movement. Could you talk maybe a bit about how Satan or Satanism played into the early feminist movement?
Sure. Let me break out that book for you, actually. So it's a quite weighty tome, and I'll try to summarize it.
It's even more weighty in its original dissertation form.
Yeah, so the first version had 724 pages, I think. My poor supervisors. But in this book, what I look at is how these ideas that first appeared in Romanticism and Socialism soon were picked up by feminists. Feminists who identified Christianity as one of the supporting pillars of patriarchy, where God was the father and his male priests were suppressing women in various ways. And of course it makes sense if you have that take on things, to look at God's adversary, the devil, as a potential ally. But not only did it make sense like that, it was also, of course, a very drastic polemical move. So they wanted to provoke people. They wanted to, get people's attention, and in a way, it was effective. On the other hand, and that's sort of the sad end of this story, it wasn't really that well suited for political feminism, for feminists who actually wanted to gain broad support, for example, for women attaining the vote. So this satanic polemic had to be scrapped in the end, because it was just too provocative.
Being associated with Satan wasn't a positive thing in the long run, is that?
It wasn't, and these women working towards getting the vote, they had to find allies, and one of those important allies was the very Christian women's temperance movement. So people who wanted to banish alcohol, and in that context, of course, this satanic rhetoric didn't really work.
Sure, makes sense. Yeah. So, if I remember correctly, one of the primary sources that this feminist movement uses is the story in Genesis about the serpent and the tree of knowledge, where the serpent is reinterpreted, you could say, as a sort of messenger of freedom and liberation from this tyrannical God, which fits into this feminist narrative. Could you expand on that maybe a bit more, and how that story is used within this movement?
Sure. So one of the reasons why these feminists picked up on that story in particular would have been that it was being employed at this time by anti-feminists. So for example, male doctors would use it to justify not giving pain relief to women when they were giving birth, due to giving birth in pain being a punishment from God for accepting the forbidden fruit from the devil. And historically, this story had been used to explain why women were more prone to be witches, for example. So it had a long history of very destructive patriarchal use. So it was only natural, I guess, that these feminists would choose that story and turn it on its head. There are other reasons as well. For example, that there was an esoteric influence on this feminist movement from Theosophy. And Theosophy had this Gnostic strand where they had picked up the notion from ancient Gnosticism that the serpent was in fact a benevolent bringer of gnosis rather than an evil creature.
I was just going to ask about that actually, because I believe the same interpretation is used by Helena Blavatsky in one of her books. So there is a connection there between the feminist movement and Theosophy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a bit ambiguous in some ways. There were also people within Theosophy who were anti-feminists, but of course Theosophy offered these sort of leadership roles for women, and there were strong connections to the women's movement. And particularly in the US, some of the most central figures were both Theosophists and feminists. And this group of women were among those who most actively reinterpreted the Eden narrative in this manner.
Just so our audience can get a better grasp of what we're talking about, maybe you could briefly just summarize what Theosophy is, and perhaps Theosophy being part of this wider popular movement around the turn of the last century, which we often refer to as occultism. Maybe just very briefly we could talk about what that entails.
Sure. So Theosophy, of course, is a very old word, but in the sense that of a modern movement, it's something that's founded in New York City in 1875, and the primary figure in it is a woman called Helena Blavatsky, born in present-day Ukraine, who had a background in spiritualism, that is, talking to the spirits of the dead, and came from a family with esoteric interests. So she was quite well read in esotericism. And this group got together in New York and started having these sort of discussions and lectures on esoteric topics, and decided to form an organization. And the most basic notion in Theosophy is that all religions share an inner esoteric core that has been misunderstood by the exoteric priests and adherents of these religions. And this core they attempted to sort of pick out of these religions and create a new synthesis. And they also had ideas about supernormal powers within man that could be cultivated. So those were two of the main tenets, and there were also claims about being in contact with hidden masters on a different plane of existence that guided them. But an interesting thing with Theosophy was that it was intensely critical of organized religion, and at the same time it sort of picked elements from all the major religious traditions. So it was very much a bricolage of different religions in that sense, of course filtered through this Western occultist sensibility at the outset, but then in the long run also evolving in interaction with, for example, people in India who became interested in Theosophy. So it became very much a global phenomenon, one of the first examples perhaps of a truly globalized form of esotericism.
Yeah. Theosophy is so fascinating, and as you've pointed out, it has been so incredibly influential, right, on so many different artists and other spiritual and philosophical thinkers in the 20th century, and yet perhaps the majority of people aren't aware of how hugely influential this movement has been, which is why it's so wonderful that you and your colleagues are doing the work to bring this to light. Speaking about all these reinterpretations of Satan in political movements, in Romance literature, in Theosophy, would any of these people call themselves Satanists? Or how was that? How did they conceptualize that?
So at this point, none of them would have self-identified as Satanists. And with someone like Helena Blavatsky, if we look at one of her major works called The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, it has chapters that I would say are quite clearly pro-Satanic. So there's sort of a strand of Satanism in Theosophy, in a sense. On the other hand, this is not really a central trait in the movement, so I wouldn't, by any stretch of the imagination, designate Theosophy a form of Satanism. But there is this strand of ideas like that in it. Right. And with the Romantics, I mean, the preceding generation of older and by then conservative Romantics called these people the Satanic school in poetry, but that wasn't meant as a compliment. Right. And none of them self-identified as Satanists. So that's also a later development.
So when do we see the first people or groups that do self-identify as Satanist?
So the first person probably ever to self-identify as a Satanist was a Polish decadent author called Stanisław Przybyszewski, who was a good friend of August Strindberg and Edvard Munch and other people from the sort of Scandinavian artistic elite. And he was active in Berlin in the 1890s and started writing pamphlets and also art criticism where he expressed pro-Satanic ideas. And he also self-identified as a Satanist. And he was probably the first person to sort of formulate a system of thought around the figure of Satan as something positive.
You mentioned Przybyszewski, but was this an organized form of Satanism, or was he sort of just an individual?
So there was this group that gathered around him when he moved back to Poland that called themselves Satan's Children after one of his novels. But this was not really a Satanist group, however. So the first attempt to create an organized form of Satanism actually took place in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where a few years later there was this gentleman calling himself Ben Kadosh. His real name was Carl William Hansen, and he was a Freemason, an occultist, and also a Luciferian. And he wrote this little pamphlet presenting his occultist satanic worldview. And it appears that he tried to organize a sort of satanic circle. To what extent this was successful is a bit difficult to establish, but he definitely had the ambition at least.
Interesting. So this would be early 20th century?
Yeah, so I think the pamphlet was published in 1906, 1903, something like that, yeah.
And probably the most famous, historically, the Satanist movement would probably be the Church of Satan, or LaVeyan Satanism, as it is sometimes called. And that appears in the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
What's the connection between LaVey and his Satanism and these earlier occult or esoteric forms of Satanism? Is there a direct line of influence, or is LaVey's more atheistically inspired Satanism a sort of unique development?
Yeah, you could say there are some historical connections, but with some of the major examples, LaVey has no connection to them. So, for example, he's not inspired by Theosophy. He probably never heard of Stanisław Przybyszewski, and I'm pretty sure he had never heard of Ben Kadosh in Copenhagen. So there are no direct lines of influence there. On the other hand, LaVey was very well read, and he knew the Romantic poets, and he definitely knew some of the influential early literary depictions of Satanism. And one of them is this novel, a French novel from the 1890s, Là-bas, or Down There, by an author called Huysmans. And this is supposedly a documentary depiction of what Satanism was like in turn of the century Paris. Of course, it isn't. It's mostly stuff that Huysmans made up. Yeah. But this would have been among their influences on LaVeyan, who was well read in decadent literature like this. Right. And he would have known, John Milton. He would have known the Romantics. He would have known Huysmans. Would have known Baudelaire, other decadent poets who were doing something satanic 100 years prior. But his specific take on what Satanism is, that's something fairly unique, I'd say.
So he's aware of the literary reinterpretations and depictions of Satan, but not necessarily influenced by Blavatsky and these more occult movements, is that?
Well, I mean, Anton LaVeyan has a bit of an ambivalent attitude towards occultism. In many ways, he dismisses occultism as being for suckers. His take on Satanism is much more street smart, based in a sort of Carney-style appropriation of the figure of the devil as a tool for provocation, a tool for finding ways to indulge in the pleasures of life.
Yeah. One thing that I've maybe not struggled, but that I'm curious about when it comes to the Church of Satan is there ritual practices, which, as they have been described, appear very sort of theatrical and colorful. Could you talk a bit about these rituals and what they signified and perhaps what they were?
Sure. So Anton LaVeyan's take on ritual is that it's psychodrama. It can affect change in people through, of course, psychological means. So there's nothing necessarily supernatural going on most of the time.
Okay.
So there's an ambiguity there as well, where LaVeyan would sometimes speak of like tapping into a dark force in nature and things like that. And he was fond of making references to having, affected something supernatural at times. But it's a bit difficult to tell how serious he was about these things. For example, he could talk about causing an earthquake by playing his organ, or cutting something from a newspaper and then cutting off someone's head, and then that person died in a car accident where his head was cut off, and that sort of thing. But as a whole, Anton LaVeyan's take on ritual is that it's psychodrama. So it's something that you stage to have the appropriate effect on yourself, and it's very much centered on the self at all times. So sort of the effect that you want is modifying something in your own behavior. So it's very much sort of in tune with the pop psychology of the time, but with this sort of Halloween-y framework around it.
LaVeyan Satanism, maybe until very recently, is probably the most famous and popular form of or movement of Satanism. Would you agree?
Possibly. I mean, it's in terms of being an organization with actual members, definitely. Yeah. On the other hand, I think there are some pop culture varieties, for example, connected to the Scandinavian black metal scene, sure, that were probably just as visible, if not more visible at times.
That actually brings us to another very significant question, at least for me, which is LaVeyan Satanism on the one hand, which represents what's often referred to as atheistic Satanism. And then on the other hand, you have something that is also sometimes referred to as theistic Satanism. And I'm curious about whether this is a legitimate dichotomy, or if it's probably a sort of generalization or simplification. What's going on with these two?
So I think you're right to say that it's an oversimplification. On the other hand, it's in terms of sort of ideal types, it's a functioning simplification. And with the early varieties, with people like Ben Kadash, that's definitely a theistic form of Satanism. So there are examples of that quite early. But then you get this more or less atheistic version in the 60s with the Church of Satan in California. And that then branches off in 1975 into the Temple of Set. And the Temple of Set is founded by a man called Michael Aquino and a group of people around him. And Michael Aquino is basically at this time Anton LaVeyan's right-hand man. So he runs the official newsletter of the Church of Satan, and he's a significant figure in this context. However, he starts getting fed up with Anton LaVey selling degrees in the Church of Satan. And for Anton LaVey, who was very much a person focused on success here and now, a good Satanist would be someone who earned a lot of money. So for him it would make sense to sell degrees, I guess. But Michael Aquino had a more, let's say, spiritual take on the matter. And there was also some, we could call it theological or diabological disagreement between the two, where Michael Aquino was more drawn to the notion of Satan as an actual entity existing separately from our psyches. So Michael Aquino does this ritual where he establishes contact with a figure identifying himself as the Prince of Darkness, who then explains that he would prefer being known by his earliest name, which is Set, the ancient Egyptian god Set, rather than the Hebrew fiend Satan. And at this point, Michael Aquino and a group of others then establish the Temple of Set.
So that would be, in this context, the Temple of Set would be a more theistic form of Satanism than, for example, LaVeyan?
Yeah, so these two are usually held up as the prime examples of theistic Satanism and atheistic Satanism. Yeah.
As I've tried studying this topic, it seems that when it comes to theistic Satanists, like in this case, it is a veneration, sometimes worship of Satan, but it is a Satan that has been reinterpreted in many ways, or at least connected with pre-Christian polytheistic gods like Pan, the Greek god, or Set in this case. Are there examples of theistic Satanists that actually worship the devil as understood in Christianity, as a representation of pure evil, basically? Or is it just this reinterpreted?
Yeah. So let's say there are some tendencies perhaps in that direction with people like Pishubyshevsky and Ben Kadash, but they also largely reinterpret the figure. But their Satan is closer to the biblical version, I would say, than what you find with someone like Michael Aquino. But the first real example of someone fully embracing the traditional Christian notion of what Satan is would be the Scandinavian black metal scene in the early 1990s, late 80s perhaps, where a group of people decide to actually worship evil.
And is that a sort of an aspect of the black metal community that has continued since then, or was that confined to the early 90s?
So let's say there's always been a fairly tiny, hard core of these evil worshipping Satanists within the black metal scene, but it's an ideology that is much too extreme to really have mass appeal. So it's always been a small group within this fairly populous subculture.
How organized was this, and how was this manifested, or how was this practiced, perhaps, in this community?
Well, in terms of organizations, there was a group in Norway that called itself the Black Circle, and in Sweden we had something called the True Satanist Horde, and these were both loose networks, perhaps, rather than actual organizations. But they had some ambitions in that direction, especially the True Satanist Horde, which was more long-lived than the Black Circle in Norway, which imploded after members started murdering each other. But this then evolved into other things that were related to the black metal scene, but not necessarily part of it, like for example something called the Temple of the Black Light, which is a group started in Sweden, which is an example of theistic, magic-focused Satanism, which, well, one of the members came from the black metal community, but the group as such is not really confined to that context.
Okay. This also brings to mind a distinction that I found, not so much in academic literature, but I found online, is people making a distinction between Satanism on the one hand and Luciferianism on the other, as being distinct movements and distinct theologies entirely. Is there a reality to this distinction, or have you encountered this before?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's another category that you sometimes see would be devil worshippers, where some of the people in the black metal scene would perhaps use that as a self-designation, like I'm a devil worshipper. But it's also been used in a somewhat pejorative sense by LaVeyan Satanists to distinguish what they think is the one true Satanism from something that's perhaps a more primitive system of thought, devil worship.
Right. Okay. So Lucifer and Satan, they're not considered different entities or different characters, or do we find this in the literature?
Sure. There are some groups that would make a distinction between the two. And you could say that with Luciferianism in general, it's a bit more focused on perhaps the devil's connection to Enlightenment ideals, the devil as a bringer of gnosis and spiritual insight, as opposed to perhaps the embrace of the more demonic and chthonic sides of the figure in other contexts.
It's very interesting. It's sometimes, when it comes to these topics, and I guess religion in general, it's so easy to find claims and information online that is very unreliable, right? So this is why, at least to me, it's so important that we have proper scholarship on the topic, which can provide legitimate information. Just to end this little conversation, I'm curious about developments since the 90s, basically. What's the world of Satanism today? Is the Church of Satan still as prominent as it was? What are the sort of the newer movements that have appeared, and if you have any sort of predictions, or if you can see any kind of trajectory going forward into the future?
Yeah, so probably the major development in Satanism over the last couple of decades would be the founding of the Temple of Satan in the US, which was really created as a way of trolling conservative Christians. Perhaps you could say it's a response to the sort of right-wing turn in American politics with evangelical Christians supporting Donald Trump. And it, of course, was a very efficient way to provoke conservative Christians, as it always has been. But what really distinguished this new group from the Church of Satan was that it fully embraced ideologies like feminism and had a much more egalitarian tendency, where the Church of Satan is a very elitist, in a way neoliberal group. And these guys a lot of them were socialists, feminists, queer, etc., etc. And it's also an interesting example of where academic research can have an unexpected impact, since this book of mine, Satanic Feminism, ended up on their reading lists.
Oh, really?
Yeah. On the other hand, this book has also been picked up by conservative Catholics who want to demonstrate that feminism has always been satanic.
I see.
So, I mean, scholarship can be used by all sorts of groups.
So it's almost like it's coming back to its it's almost like a full circle moment, in a sense, where the early earliest forms of Satanism were very much used in a political sense in the feminist movement and sometimes left-wing socialist movements. And that's very much apparent today as well with the Temple of Satan too.
I would say that it's very much a full circle moment. But the thing with Satanism that you always have to remember is that there are so many different varieties, as with all religions, of course. For example, scholars will prefer to talk of Islams rather than Islam, and it's the same thing with Satanism. There are Satanisms in the plural. And basically you could probably find a Satanism that would suit you, in this vast spectrum of varieties, as long as you're not, you don't get the heebie-jeebies from the figure of Satan himself. You could find something that would suit you. You could find a feminist, socialist, egalitarian type of Satanism. You could find a highly individualist, neoliberal form of Satanism. You could find something focused on spiritual transformation and transmutation. Or you could even find a Satanism focused on antisocial behavior and transgression.
I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. Before we leave, maybe do you have anything going on that you want to promote? Any projects coming up or books that you're excited about?
Right now I'm working on a book on spirituality in Japanese martial arts in the West. That's my main project at this time. And I've said this before, I'm not really working on anything related to Satanism now, and I don't plan to write anything new on it. I've said that before, but it always turns out that I return to this topic for some reason. Sure. It's a very rich topic, so I'm sure I will have more work on Satanism coming up eventually.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Per, for talking to us today.
Thank you.
And good luck with your future project.
Thanks.